The Social Self. On March 28, 1986, in New York City, Cynthia and Joseph Germanata welcomed their first daughter, Stephanie Joanne Angelina Germanata, into the world. It didn't take long for Cynthia and Joe to discover that Stephanie was artistically gifted. Stephanie was playing the piano by ear at the age of 4, and soon she was also singing, songwriting, and acting. By her early teens, Stephanie had a voice teacher and took acting lessons while starring in local plays, but her creativity and talents weren't always celebrated. What was seen as gifted to some was seen as odd and eccentric, even freakish, to many of her peers, leaving Stephanie to struggle with bullying, ostracism, and deep feelings of insecurity through much of her adolescence and early adulthood. Nonetheless, Stephanie endured these challenges and, by early 2008, at the age of 22, she released her debut album, The Fame, and the person now known worldwide as Lady Gaga was born. Lady Gaga has achieved international fame as a singing, songwriting, and performing powerhouse. Indeed, she is one of the best-selling musical artists of all time and has won countless awards for her musical achievements, including 6 Grammy Awards and 13 MTV Video Music Awards. Yet in the eyes of many people, and undoubtedly herself, Lady Gaga is far more than a singer and performer. She is a Golden Globe-winning actress, a practicing Christian, and a passionate advocate for LGBT rights. She is a widely photographed and lauded fashion icon. She is a rape survivor. She is someone who has battled anorexia, bulimia, and depression. She is a philanthropist, providing support for many causes, such as relief efforts after the 2010 Haiti earthquake and Hurricane Sandy in 2012. Outline: the nature of the social self, origins of the sense of self, self-esteem, motives driving self-evaluation, self-regulation, motivating and controlling behavior, self-presentation. She is the founder of an influential nonprofit organization, the Born This Way Foundation, that advocates youth empowerment and anti-bullying, among other youth-related issues. The list goes on. Lady Gaga provides a treasure trove of examples to illustrate the concept of the self in social psychology. Revealing how profoundly social the self is, she has spoken widely and openly about the ways that the social obstacles and pain she endured as a child have shaped who she is today. Her fans see her as a symbol of self-acceptance and self-confidence, what social psychologists call self-esteem. And her many personas show how, like Lady Gaga, most of us have many sides to who we are and think of ourselves in many different ways. As a hardworking student, a loyal friend, a chocolate aficionado, an awkward dancer, a romantic, a skilled procrastinator, an aspiring writer. In this chapter, we draw a portrait of the self as it is constructed, maintained, and negotiated in the social environment. Who is Lady Gaga? Lady Gaga, pictured here receiving an award for her musical accomplishments, showing her unique fashion sense, and campaigning for Hillary Clinton during the 2016 presidential race, has many different selves. The nature of the social self. A man has as many social selves as there are individuals who recognize him, as many different social selves as there are distinct groups about whose opinion he cares. William James. In his book, The Principles of Psychology, 1890, William James introduced many concepts about the self that inspire research to this day. One of his most enduring contributions is reflected in the title of this chapter, The Social Self. James coined the term, the social me, to refer to what we know about ourselves from social relationships. James's term reflects his conviction that the self is not something to be distinguished from the social world, but rather is a social entity through and through. Who a person is in one social context with soccer buddies is often not the same as who the person is in another social environment with a romantic partner. Recall from Chapter 1 that there are cultural differences in the self-conceptions that people hold dear. In this chapter, we explore cultural and other key social origins of the self. As James articulated over 100 years ago, our sense of who we are is forged in large part by our interactions with others. The accuracy of self-knowledge. Before we explore the social underpinnings of the self, it's reasonable to ask how we figure out who we are. The ancient Greek admonition to know thyself implies that a major source of self-knowledge is, well, ourselves. Indeed, our self-understanding is largely a product of construal processes, our making sense of our experiences, proclivities, preferences, attributes, and so on. Researchers like Dan McAdams, 2008, even argue that people weave intricate stories about themselves. If self-knowledge is based in considerable part on our construals, what does that say about the accuracy of self-knowledge? That is, if you wanted to find out who someone really is, who would you ask? Most of us assume that the best person to ask is, in fact, the person we want to know about. After all, this person has privileged access to self-relevant information, such as past experiences, not to mention current thoughts, feelings, and intentions. Yet we're also quick to recognize that people can sometimes possess a startling lack of self-insight. Recall the research described in Chapter 1, in which Nisbet and Wilson, 1977, discovered that people can readily provide explanations for their behaviors that are not, in fact, accurate. Someone might say that she picked her favorite nightgown because of its texture or color, when in fact she picked it out because it was the last one she saw. Even our ability to report accurately on more important decisions, such as why we chose job candidate A over job candidate B, why we like Joe better than Jack, or how we solved a particular problem, can be wide of the mark. Sometimes our lack of self-insight can be a protective measure. There are certain things many of us would rather not know about ourselves. But much of the time, we draw inaccurate conclusions about the self because we don't have access to certain mental processes, such as those that lead us to prefer objects we looked at last. Such mental processes are non-conscious, occurring outside of our awareness, leaving us to generate alternative plausible accounts for our preferences and behaviors instead. Given such roadblocks, how can a person gain accurate self-knowledge? Vizier and Mel, 2008, tackled this question over a series of studies. In one study, they asked participants to rate how accurate they think people are at assessing how much they themselves perform 25 different behaviors. For example, reading, singing, watching TV. They also asked participants how accurate they think people are at predicting how often other people they know well perform these behaviors. For every single behavior, the participants rated the accuracy of self-predictions to be greater than the accuracy of predictions about others. In other words, there was a widespread assumption that each of us is our own best expert. In a subsequent study, however, the same researchers again had participants report on their enactment of the 25 behaviors. They also recruited informants, close friends, parents, and romantic partners of the participants to report on the participants' enactment of the behaviors. Then, over a 4-day period, with participants wearing a device that records the ambient sounds of their daily lives, Vizier and Mel measured the actual frequency of participants' behaviors. Contrary to the assumption that we know ourselves the best, they found that the reports of close others are as accurate as our own in anticipating our actual behavior. But there's more to the story. Interestingly, ratings made by the self and ratings made by close others independently predicted the self's behavior. That is, both the self and others have at least some accurate insight into who one is. But a closer inspection of the findings showed that there are certain aspects of a person that are uniquely known to the self and certain aspects that are uniquely known to others. Because we have greater information than others do about our inner states, such as our thoughts and feelings, we are better judges of our internal traits, being optimistic or pessimistic, for instance. Other people, though, have better information for judging our external traits by observing our overt behavior, such as whether we are boisterous or outspoken. Vizier and colleagues further point out that motivational forces might also be at play. As we will explore in depth later in this chapter, most people want to think highly of themselves, so when it comes to traits to which we attach a lot of value, such as creativity, other people tend to know us better than we know ourselves, because their judgments are less likely to be tainted by the desire to arrive at favorable assessments of the self. The organization of self-knowledge. I don't know anybody here but the hostess, and of course, in a deeper sense, myself. Regardless of its accuracy, there's no question that most of us have an enormous pool of self-knowledge. Collectively, all this self-knowledge is stored in our memories in some fashion, and it's capable of being retrieved, elaborated on, and used as a source of information and continuity as well as comfort or dismay. Social psychologists assume that self-knowledge is stored in memory in cognitive structures known as self-schemas. built from past experience. Self-schemas represent people's beliefs and feelings about themselves, both in general and in particular kinds of situations. Consider the domain of conscientiousness. Each of us has a self-schema stored in memory, representing our beliefs and feelings about how conscientious or not we are. These beliefs and feelings are based on our experiences in situations where conscientiousness was relevant, such as studying for exams or remembering a sibling's birthday. Like the schemas we have about personality traits, other people, situations, and objects, the schemas we have about ourselves serve as more than simple storehouses of self-knowledge. They also perform an organizing function by helping us navigate and make sense of all the information that bombards us every day. Self-schema, a cognitive structure derived from past experience that represents a person's beliefs and feelings about the self, both in general and in specific situations. In one of the earliest studies of self-schemas, Hazel Marcus, 1977, hypothesized that if self-schemas exist, then a person who has a self-schema in a particular domain, for example, a schema about how extroverted she is, should process information in that domain more quickly, retrieve evidence consistent with the schema more rapidly, and readily reject information that contradicts the schema. To test these hypotheses, Marcus first identified participants who labeled themselves as either quite dependent or quite independent. She labeled the participants who rated themselves closer to the extremes of dependence and independence as schematic. She also identified aschematic participants, those who rated themselves moderately on this dimension and for whom neither dependence nor independence was important to their self-definition. Several weeks later, the participants rated how well a series of traits presented on a computer screen described them. The schematic participants judged schema-relevant traits as true or not true of themselves much more quickly than aschematic participants, suggesting that people are particularly attuned to information that maps onto an existing self-schema. Also, when asked to do so, the schematic participants were able to generate many more behaviors consistent with the schema-relevant traits, suggesting that past actions and experiences supporting the self-schema are abundant in memory and come readily to mind. Finally, the schematic participants were more likely to refute feedback from a personality test that contradicted their self-schemas, such as independent participants being told they were actually dependent. In short, regardless of their accuracy, self-schemas serve as a basic unit of organization for self-knowledge and influence our interpretations and judgments of ourselves and the social world. Looking back, the notion that the self is fundamentally social has long been recognized. As the immediate or broader social context shifts, so too may the nature of the self. Self-knowledge is derived in large part from construal processes, is limited by what people have access to, and can be distorted by motivational forces. Self-knowledge is stored in memory in cognitive structures known as self-schemas. Origins of the sense of self. What are the building blocks of self-construals? A social psychologist would posit that a sense of self comes primarily from specific ways the social situation shapes the self. The social situation can be as concrete as the presence of a close friend or a more academically successful classmate. It can also be rather abstract and diffuse, such as norms conveyed by key institutions in one's culture or by members of an important social group, such as one's gender group. Family and other socialization agents. We learn what attitudes and behaviors are socially appropriate from parents, siblings, teachers, peers, and other socialization agents. This process happens directly as when parents insist that their children share, take turns, and say thank you, and indirectly as when teachers model appropriate behaviors. By encouraging certain behaviors and providing opportunities for particular activities, socialization agents influence the personality traits, abilities, and preferences we come to think of as our own. Imagine a woman whose Jewish parents took her to a synagogue every week as a child, insisted she take Hebrew lessons, and made sure she had a bat mitzvah ceremony. Because of this upbringing, it's not surprising that, as an adult, being Jewish became central to this woman's sense of self. Box 3.1, see page 68, provides another illustration of how family, in particular siblings, can profoundly influence the nature of the self. Upbringing shapes the self. Being raised in a Jewish family undoubtedly influences how the girl in the above photo, shown at her bat mitzvah ceremony, defines herself. Another way that family and other socialization agents shape the self is captured by the notion that we come to know ourselves by imagining what others think of us. The sociologist Charles H. Cooley, 1902, coined the phrase looking glass self to refer to the idea that other people's reactions to us, their approval or disapproval, serve as a mirror of sorts. That is, self-knowledge is derived in part from reflected self-appraisals, our beliefs about others' reactions to us. Throughout our lives, we experience overt or subtle reactions and appraisals from others. For example, your parents praise your accomplishments, a romantic partner makes light of your fears, a teacher assigns you a challenging task, your peers laugh heartily at your jokes. Reactions and appraisals like these convey that you're competent, neurotic, have potential, or are funny. In short, we see ourselves partly through the eyes of those around us. Reflected self-appraisal, a belief about what others think of oneself. Box 3.1, focus on evolution, siblings and the social self. What do most U.S. presidents, English and Canadian prime ministers, Oprah Winfrey, Bette Davis, and all of the actors who have portrayed James Bond, except Daniel Craig, have in common? What do Virginia Woolf, Ben Franklin, Charles Darwin, Mohandas Gandhi, Vincent van Gogh, and Madonna have in common? The first group are firstborns, the second are laterborns. What does birth order have to do with a person's sense of self? According to Frank Sulloway, 1996-2001, a great deal. Sulloway has looked at sibling dynamics from an evolutionary perspective and arrived at a born-to-rebel hypothesis. Across species, Sulloway theorizes, sibling conflict, especially when resources are scarce, is frequent, widespread, and occasionally deadly. Sand sharks devour one another before birth in the oviducts of the mother until one well-fed young shark emerges. Once a blue-footed booby drops below 80% of its body weight, its siblings exclude it from the nest or worse, peck it to death. Infant hyenas are born with large canine teeth, which they often use to deadly effect on their newly born siblings. Even in humans, young siblings engage in frequent conflict, up to one squabble every 5 minutes. Humans have evolved adaptations or solutions to threats to survival, and one such adaptation involves a means of resolving sibling conflict. According to the principle of diversification, siblings develop different personality traits, abilities, and preferences within the same family so that they can peacefully occupy different niches. Throughout most of development, older siblings are larger and more powerful and often act as surrogate parents. They are invested in the status quo, which benefits them. Things were fine until you came along. In contrast, younger siblings with the establishment niche already occupied by their older siblings develop in ways that make them inclined to challenge the family's status quo. In a review of 196 studies of personality and birth order, Sulloway found that older siblings tend to be more assertive and dominant and more achievement-oriented and conscientious. These traits are consistent with older siblings' more assertive, powerful role in the family. In contrast, younger siblings tend to be more agreeable, and they are likely to be more open to novel ideas and experiences. This social self emerges as younger siblings learn to coexist with their more dominant older siblings, which accounts for their elevated agreeableness, and as they find imaginative ways to carve out their own niche in the world, which accounts for their increased openness to experience. Sibling differences. Firstborns like Prince William Top are often more responsible and more likely to support the status quo than younger siblings, like Prince Harry, who often are more mischievous, more open to novel experiences, and more likely to rebel against authority. The idea that we gain self-knowledge through reflected self-appraisals might seem to suggest that we have little say in how we see ourselves, but the key concept here is that we internalize how we think others perceive us, not necessarily how they actually see us. In fact, our reflected self-appraisals often don't correlate highly with the way other people evaluate us. For example, far more people think they are shy than are actually perceived as shy by others. Figuring out how, and to what degree, reflected self-appraisals influence a person's sense of self can be tricky. For example, Amy's view of herself as a clumsy person could stem from her perception that her family and friends see her this way and convey that impression to her, but it's also possible that her view of herself as clumsy has been detected by other people who then convey that impression back to her. The way we view ourselves often affects the perceptions of other people, who then reflect those views back to us in a kind of echo chamber. Oh, would some power the gift give us to see ourselves as others see us. Robert Burns. Situationism and the social self. In many a film depicting the social lives of teenagers, you see the teenager characters adapting who they are to the people around them. Surrounded by their studious classmates, they readily compare homework notes and share gripes about the difficult tests they had to take. In the presence of the cool kids, they convey nonchalance about their schoolwork. The chameleon-like nature of the teenagers in such films hits at a deeper and more universal truth, that our social self shifts from one situation to another. This notion that the social self changes across different contexts is consistent with the principle of situationism, and it's supported by abundant empirical evidence. Aspects of the self that are relevant and distinctive in the social context. Students who are rebellious and free-spirited in the dorm will shift to a more sober and conventional demeanor around parents or professors. Someone who sees herself as relaxed and outspoken when with her close friends may be shy and inhibited when interacting with a group of new acquaintances. Marcus and Worf, 1987, coined the term working self-concept to refer to the idea that only a subset of a person's vast pool of self-knowledge is brought to mind in any given context, usually the subset that's most relevant or appropriate in the current situation. Thus, for example, notions of the self related to relationships are likely to be the mind's prime focus with a romantic partner, whereas notions of the self related to competition are likely to be at the forefront during an important sports match. Working self-concept, a subset of self-knowledge that is brought to mind in a particular context. Context and sense of self. In the HBO original series Girls, the character Shoshana Shapiro, played by actress Zozia Mehmet, moves to Japan for a job. Here she is depicted walking around town in her newfound home, showing clear signs that her sense of self, including her fashion sense, has shifted to fit the context. William McGuire and Alice Padawar Singer, 1978, proposed that we also tend to highlight what makes us unique or distinctive in a given situation. To test this hypothesis, they asked sixth graders at different schools to describe themselves. On average, children wrote 12 statements referring to their recreational activities, attitudes, friends, and school activities. As it turned out, the children defined themselves according to how they differed from their classmates. Figure 3.1. 30% of the children who were especially young or old compared with their classmates, that is 6 months from the most common age of their classmates, mentioned their age in their self-definition, whereas only 19% of the other children did. 44% of the children who were born outside the United States mentioned this biographical fact, whereas only 7% of those born in the United States mentioned that fact about themselves. 26% of the children of the minority gender in their class mentioned their gender as part of their self-definition, compared with 11% of the majority gender. At least in the Western world, what's most central to identity is what makes a person distinct. Figure 3.1. Distinctiveness and the social self. Percentage of students who mention a particular fact in self-definition. American children define themselves according to how they are unique and different from their classmates. So you have typical and unusual, age, place of birth, and gender. And every time it's an unusual age, place of birth, or gender, it is mentioned more often. Malleability and stability. Most of us would readily agree that our sense of self shifts depending on the social context. Yet we also experience a sense of continuity in the self, the feeling that we have a stable core self. How can we reconcile what appear to be dueling notions of malleability, something that can be shaped, and stability in the self? There are several paths of reconciliation. First, although one's working self-concept varies across situations, there are nevertheless core aspects of self-knowledge that are likely to be what a person thinks of first when thinking about the self. Thus, although Jing Jiang may see herself as painfully shy around members of the opposite sex, but outgoing with her girlfriends, she sees herself as a good listener no matter whom she is around. For LGBT people who frequently face the decision of whether or not to disclose their LGBT status, their sexual minority identity is likely to be a core, cross-situationally noticeable aspect of the self. Second, a person's overall pool of self-knowledge remains relatively stable over time, providing a sense of self-continuity even as different pieces of self-knowledge come to the fore in different contexts. Thus, your belief that you're lazy may not be part of your working self-concept in a job interview, but it's nonetheless stored in memory, ready to be retrieved when you're lounging around watching TV instead of doing the laundry. Finally, although a person's sense of self may shift depending on the context, it's likely that these shifts conform to a predictable, stable pattern. Take a person who sees herself as confident around her friends but as insecure around her overly critical mother. Although this person's sense of self clearly shifts according to the social context, it's not as if she's confident around her friends one day and insecure around them the next. In other words, the malleability in this individual self is itself stable. Whenever she is around her friends, she sees herself as confident, whereas being around her mother reliably shifts her self-concept to include being insecure. In short, the social self is defined by two truths. It is malleable, shifting from one context to another, but it also has core components that persist across contexts. Culture and the social self. The American Declaration of Independence and the Analects of the Chinese philosopher Confucius have shaped the lives of billions of people, yet they reflect radically different ideas about the social self. The Declaration of Independence prioritized the rights and freedoms of the individual, and it protected those rights and liberties from infringement by others. Confucius emphasized the importance of knowing one's place in society, of honoring traditions, duties, and social roles, and of thinking of others before the self. The differences reflected in these documents run deep in the cultures that people inhabit. In Western societies, people are concerned about their individuality, about freedom, and about self-expression. Our adages reflect this. The squeaky wheel gets the grease. If you've got it, flaunt it. In Asian cultures, homilies and folk wisdom encourage a different view of the self. The empty wagon makes the most noise. The nail that stands up is pounded down. Hazel Marcus, Shinobu Katayama, and Harry Triandis have offered far-reaching theories about how cultures vary in the social selves they encourage and how these different conceptions of the self shape the emotions we feel, the motivations that drive us, and our ways of perceiving the social world. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Declaration of Independence. A person of humanity wishing to establish his own character also establishes the character of others. Confucius. Independent and interdependent self-construals. As discussed in Chapter 1, many Western cultures, especially those of Northwestern Europe and former British colonies such as Canada, the United States, Australia, and New Zealand, promote an independent self-construal. In these societies, the self is an autonomous entity that is distinct and separate from others. Figure 3.2a. It's important for people to assert their uniqueness and independence, and the focus is on internal causes of behavior. These imperatives lead to a conception of the self in terms of traits that are stable across time and social context. In contrast, most other cultures in the world, notably those of East Asia, Eastern Europe, and Latin America, foster interdependent self-construals in which the self is fundamentally connected to other people. Figure 3.2b. The imperatives are to find a place within the community and to fulfill appropriate roles. There is close attention to social contexts and a recognition of the shifting demands of situations on behavior. Figure 3.2. Views of the self. A. In the independent view of the self is construed as a distinct autonomous entity, separate from others and defined by distinct traits and preferences. So the self is a circle, and mother, father, sibling, friend, and coworker are circles around the self that can touch it but don't overlap it. B. In the interdependent view of the self is construed as connected to others and defined by duties, roles, and shared preferences and traits. So in this one, you can see the self, then mother, father, sibling, friend, and coworker overlapping with the self in the interdependent view of self. These concerns lead to a conception of the self as something embedded within social relationships, roles, and duties. This kind of self-construal is prevalent in many East Asian cultures, as well as in many Eastern European cultures, South Asian cultures, African cultures, and Latin American cultures. In short, an independent self-construal promotes an inward focus on the self, whereas an interdependent self-construal encourages an outward focus on the social situation. Research shows that this difference in focus is reflected in the stories that members of different cultures construct about themselves. Cohen and Guns, 2002, asked Canadian and Asian students, a mixture of students from Hong Kong, China, Taiwan, Korea, and various South and Southeast Asian countries, to tell stories about 10 different situations in which they were the center of attention, for example, being embarrassed. Canadians were more likely than Asians to reproduce the scene from their original point of view, looking outward from their own perspective. Asians were more likely to imagine the scene as an observer might, describing it from a third-person perspective. We might say that Westerners tend to experience and recall events from the inside out, with themselves at the center, looking out at the world. Easterners are more likely to experience and recall events from the outside in, starting from the social world, looking back at themselves as an object of attention. Westerners play the lead in their personal narratives. Non-Westerners are more likely to be just one among many cast members. Figure 3.3 provides another illustration of how Westerners and East Asians differ in the degree of attention they pay to the social context. Figure 3.3, cultural differences in attention to the social context. In this study, American and Japanese participants were shown a series of cartoons with either a Caucasian boy for Americans or an Asian boy for Japanese in the center, surrounded by 4 other people who were the same in all the pictures. In some cartoons, the emotional expression of the boy, for example, happy, matched the emotional expressions on the faces of the surrounding people, happy. In other cases, as in the 2 pictures shown here, there was a mismatch in the emotional expressions of the boy, for example, angry, versus the others, happy. The researchers found that when judging an individual's emotions, the Japanese are more likely to take into account the emotions of others in the surrounding social context. Who are you? The common belief among Westerners that they are self-contained is shown by simply asking them to describe themselves. Kuhn and McPartland, 1954, invented a simple Who Am I exercise that asks people to list 20 statements that describe who they are. American self-descriptions tend to be context-free responses referring to personality traits. I'm friendly, hardworking, shy, and personal preferences. I like camping. The responses of people from interdependent cultures tend to refer to relationships with other people or groups. I am Jan's friend, and are often qualified by context. I am serious at work. I am fun-loving with my friends. Ma and Shoneman, 1997, gave the Who Am I test to American university students and to 4 different groups living in Kenya: university students, workers in Nairobi, the capital city, and traditional Maasai and Samburu herding peoples. Kenya was for decades a colony of Great Britain, and city dwellers, especially those who are educated, have had a great deal of exposure to Western culture. Kenyan students have been exposed still more to Western culture and are being educated in a Western tradition. In contrast, traditional African tribespeople have had very little contact with Westerners. Figure 3.4 shows how differently these 4 African groups view themselves. Traditional Maasai and Samburu define themselves in terms of their family, property, and position in the community. Tribespeople are constantly made aware of their roles and status in relation to family members and other groups. Kenyan students, on the other hand, are far more likely to mention personal characteristics. Kenyan students, in fact, differ only slightly from American students. Workers in Nairobi are in between the tribespeople and the students. These findings illustrate that different self-construals can emerge even among those who ostensibly live within the same culture. That is, culture is made up of more than just one's country of residence. one's occupation, educational institution, religion, race, social class. Each of these can exert cultural influences of its own, shaping self-construals in more independent or interdependent directions. Figure 3.4, self-characterization in 4 African groups. The results from the study suggest that Westernization is associated with the development of a more independent self-construal. Percentage of category responses, roles and group memberships, personal characteristics. So for American undergraduates, personal characteristics is much higher. For Kenyan undergraduates, personal characteristics is almost as much higher. For workers in Nairobi, roles and group memberships is about twice as high as personal characteristics. For the Maasai tribes people, roles and group memberships is much higher and personal characteristics hardly anything. And for the Samburu tribes people, roles and group memberships is even higher with hardly anything about personal characteristics. Box 3.3 expands on the example of social class differences in self-construal, first noted in Chapter 1. Gender is yet another example of a cultural divide that has implications for self-construals. Box 3.2 focus on culture and neuroscience, culture and the social self in the brain. As we saw in our discussion of reflected appraisals and the brain, when people are asked to judge themselves with respect to various trait dimensions, a certain region of the brain known as the medial prefrontal cortex is particularly active. This suggests that this part of the frontal lobe is involved in processes that represent self-knowledge. Zhu and his colleagues conducted a study using an interesting twist on this paradigm to ascertain whether many of the cultural differences in self-construal discussed in this chapter would be reflected in differences in neural activation. They had Chinese participants and Western Europeans rate the applicability of different traits to themselves, their mothers, and another unrelated person. For members of both cultures, considering the applicability of the traits to themselves produced activation in the medial prefrontal cortex. But for Chinese participants, activation in this same region was also observed when participants were thinking about whether the traits characterized their mothers. For the Westerners, there was, if anything, a relative deactivation of the medial prefrontal cortex when they thought about their mothers. These findings seem to suggest that for people with interdependent self-construals, the same region of the brain represents the self and mother. They are merged within the brain. In contrast, for those with independent self-construals, the self and mother are quite distinct, all the way down to which neurons are activated in the brain. Gender and the social self. In a review of the literature on the self-concept and gender, Susan Cross and Laura Madsen, 1997, gathered evidence indicating that women in the United States tend to construe the self in more interdependent terms than men do, that is, in terms of connection to others. In contrast, men in the United States tend to prioritize difference and uniqueness, construing the self in more independent terms.